All right, welcome everyone to the Bala Cynwyd Library program. I am Autumn. You may see me at the library on occasion. Today we welcome Liz Kimball, author, professor, and Shannon, do you want to go ahead and do the honors?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Autumn. Can people hear me okay? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us on this very dark and stormy spring night. I'm Shannon Walters, and I'm really delighted to introduce tonight's speaker, Liz Kimball. She's an assistant professor in the Department of English and Philosophy at Drexel University. And Liz holds a PhD in English with an emphasis on rhetoric and composition from Temple University. And she works in community and public writing, multilingual practice, rhetorical history, and engaged teaching and inclusive pedagogies. So her new book is Translingual Inheritance, Language Diversity in Early National Philadelphia, and that's what we'll be hearing about tonight. And it examines the dimensions of linguistic practice in the German, Quaker, and African-American communities at the time of US national formation. She also works with nonprofit organizations on writing and strategy around poverty, housing, and education. And I first met Liz when she was, we were talking, it was quite a few years ago now. Does not feel that way sometimes, but she was finishing up her doctoral work during her time at Temple, and I was just starting there. We shared two beloved mentors, and while our time only briefly overlapped, I've happily followed her work and kept up with her since then. So I'm just really delighted to see her book out just this past spring, 2021, and excited to share with you her insights about language diversity in early Philadelphia. And it is so nice that, you know, as we were saying right before we started and before Janet told us where, you know, she was found from the Friends meeting at Marion, it's so nice that Zoom can bring together some disparate audiences, and that really is sort of a silver lining to this pandemic. And I'm sure, you know, publishing a book right in the middle of a pandemic isn't the most fun thing in the world, but it is definitely something to be celebrated. And it's nice that Liz can kind of bring some diverse audiences, I think, through Zoom to talk about her work. So thank you for joining us. So Liz will, you know, as Autumn said, Liz will talk for a little bit, and then we'll hopefully have some time for question and answer. So thank you, Liz. Take it away whenever you're ready.
Okay. Thank you so much, Shannon. I'm just so happy to be doing this, and I'm so grateful for the invitation. And thank you, Autumn, and everybody else with the library. It's really great to be able to speak in a nice, accessible public place. It's my, you know, constant desire to have my work be accessible to people, and yet I'm writing in these narrow academic worlds, and this is the exact kind of like translational sort of thing that the book is really about. So so I hope you'll ask questions and you know, don't take anything I say as the way it's got to be. I hope it all comes across clearly, but it's all about the dialogue. So and
before you start, Liz, let me just tell everybody, because I forgot to mention it, go ahead and type. There are too many of us, I think, to have like an open forum discussion at the end. I don't know, maybe it'll work, but if you have questions, go ahead and type them in the Q&A, and at the end, you know, as they pop up in your mind, and at the end, we'll go over the questions in the chat, and we'll discuss. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. And I know there's going to be a thousand questions about language diversity. I already want to talk more about the Welsh Quakers than I had time for, but hopefully we get a few things in here. And by the way, I thought it was so delightful to be invited to Bala Cynwyd Library because of the Welsh name. I grew up in Collegeville, which is just the most prosaic sounding place, and I always thought Bala Cynwyd was just the most beautiful romantic name for a town, and the way the spelling didn't quite look like the way it sounded. So it's a perfect place to be giving a talk about translingual history. I've been thinking about the best way into this talk today, and oops, let me share my screen here. Get this in slideshow mode. There we go. Is that good for everybody? I've been thinking about the way into this talk today, and the diverse audiences that are likely here. I'm sure you all have many forms of expertise and knowledge of your own. So I thought just it might be nice to start out with a little explanation of my own background and my own academic field and sort of academic journey. I was an English major as an undergraduate and a really, somewhat traditional undergraduate literature program where you studied each of the periods of English lit. And I loved, as any English major would, I loved reading and all of these texts that just felt like there were these beautiful tiny secrets that were just spilling out of them. And whatever the period I was studying, I was always interested in it, whether it was 17th century poetry or 19th century novels or modernist work or whatever it was. And I felt the same way about writing, that, the work of tuning language and craft and purpose and honing all of those things. But I always had this sense when I was in that English department that there was something missing, that just I couldn't quite stay within the bounds of what that work was doing. And that thing that was missing was the fact that everything we were doing was English, English language. Obviously, that's what defines an English department, is that you study literatures in English as opposed to other literatures. But the way I got around that was by doing things in other languages. So I did some intensive Japanese language study and lived in Japan for a while. When I realized it was going to take many, many, many years in Japan to achieve any kind of fluency, and I didn't want to do that, I thought I would do some Spanish work. And so I went to Guatemala and picked up some Spanish. That goes much more quickly, but even so, I didn't achieve fluency in either of those languages. But it was the struggle of putting myself in those other languages that stayed with me. The things that go on in your brain and yourself and your soul when you're working in those other languages. I graduated from college, spent a bunch of years doing community organizations in Philadelphia, and it was totally unlike my English major. There was lots of language diversity, which I didn't really think about at the time, but I realize now what it was. I was working in organizations run mostly by Black folks. I came from a fairly white background, so I was experiencing whole different ways of understanding the world and communicating with people. I was working with kids for a while whose parents had escaped the Cambodian genocide. Even just, more surface level things, watching the Italian market as it became a Mexican and Vietnamese and Italian market, and how much better that made the Italian market. Language diversity was all around me in Philly. But then I started to miss school. And so I went back to graduate school, and there I was back in an English department. And I found myself teaching English composition. And I was right back to where I started. So then I had to write a dissertation. And this is when Shannon met me. So I was curious, what was Philly like back in the time that it's famous for, when the nation was founded? So, 1776, but the decades bracketing that before and after. Was it the Philly of my community work with all of this diversity? Or was it the Philly of the American literature anthology, the language of the Declaration of Independence? Everything that was about English language in its most elevated or its most prestigious styles, its most remembered texts, right? I realized I had this great opportunity to explore the many archives across our city that are full of historic treasures and ask questions about language diversity that not many people had asked before. And as the project has grown, I've been able to frame it more broadly as speaking to our present moment. I've started to realize that it, in many ways, thinking about language diversity is a way of maybe around and through the impasse that we seem to be at with public discourse and democratic deliberation. The sense that many of us have that we seem to be a nation that no longer speaks the same language. How can we have a country of equality when people are so very different? It seems almost like people are speaking different languages. And I like to say, that language itself is, oops, that's not gonna, there it goes. Language itself is a little bit like what Homer Simpson says about alcohol. It's the cause of and solution to all of life's problems. So maybe understanding language diversity in history can help us figure out how to change our current language. It would become less about speaking the same language and more about speaking all of our languages. So before I talk about the specifics of early Philadelphia, let me take some time to lay out what I mean when I talk about language diversity, and particularly explaining the book title, which has this word translingual, which I know is not kind of an everyday type of word. So the, oops, how does this work? Okay. Sorry. It seems to only work with my trackpad, which is weird. Okay. So the obvious definition of language diversity, if you think language diversity, you probably think of the term multilingual, right? You think about lots of different languages existing in a place. This is a definition that we might think of as the container definition, and it's easy to understand when you think about our kind of everyday conception of the map of Europe, right? As you see here. In this definition, there's lots of different languages. There's French, there's German, there's Polish, there's Italian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And each has its own place in the world. This is a conception that seems obvious and inevitable to most of us, but it's really kind of a 19th century conception that comes from the nation states of Europe consolidating in the 19th century and defining nation as sort of equivalent to language, right? So how do I know I'm in France? I speak French. How do we create Germany? We take all these little nation states that had Germanic language speakers in them and we glom them all together and give it a central government, right? You take that diversity to the US and it becomes the melting pot metaphor or the tossed salad metaphor. So as we get all immigrants coming from different countries, X country comes with X language, and it makes our country this wonderful multilingual stew, right? This container model of language is actually not very accurate if you look at how languages really work. I don't know why this is doing this way. Okay. There's a couple problems with the container model. The first one is that borders are porous. We see that every day with our border disputes and border cultures. And the second is that languages are porous. So the idea that, you know, French stops and you take 5 steps to the east and German begins it doesn't really work that way. Is Sicilian a language or is it a dialect of Italian? Well, it's a dialect because it's considered part of Italy. On the other hand, Norwegian and Swedish are different languages because they're different countries. You know, and then if being in England means speaking English, are people who want to use Welsh or any of the other indigenous languages of the British Isles, are they less than English? Of course not. And we can see why that causes so many political problems and conflicts over definition. The conflicts come from the fact that we're working on a container model that isn't actually a very accurate model. It has more to do with politics than what languages are actually doing. The second reason that the container model doesn't really work is that people don't have language, people actually make language. There's no such thing exactly as having, you know, the French language sort of deposited into your brain. Human brains seem to invent languages as long as there's human communities. And we know this because when in history we have found children who grew up in the wild and managed to survive without human parents, like Mowgli in the Jungle Book, those children have not developed language because their brains had developed at a time when they weren't getting the right kinds of language input from people around them. But when humans are together, they make language. Children who are deaf, whose parents are not, who haven't taught them sign language, if you get a bunch of those children together, they'll start making their own sign language, because signing is just another way of expressing language. So, so people make language. It has far less to do with named languages than we think. So how do people make language? Even people who are multilingual or monolingual, excuse me. Why is this doing this? There we go. Even people who are monolingual are making language all the time. One way that we do it is we adjust for our interlocutors. So I might, with my Philly friends say, do you guys want to go get some beers? And when I was at college out in Indiana, I would say, are y'all going to go get some dinner, right? You adjust for your interlocutors. You could adjust for your location. I'm just going to escape this. Hang on a sec, let me fix this problem. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, so we can adjust for our location. You won't use language the same way if you're at grandma's house as you will if you're at the corner bar, right? You can adjust for purpose. So you may have an illness and your purpose in praying to God for healing may shift. Your purpose there is a little different than asking the doctor about, the appropriate action for surgery, right? People also blend codes all the time. So people who are living in a world where there's lots of English and lots of Spanish will often use what gets called Spanglish, right? Where they're blending elements of Spanish and English together, because everybody they know is sort of understanding what both codes are doing. This also happens all the time with Black folks who know how to use Black English, but also know how to use Spanish English or Standard English. They're blending and choosing from different codes as they need to, and for whatever makes sense for the situation they're in. And then finally, people also play with all of those things, right? I mean, sometimes it's appropriate to use a little curse word at grandma's house, and sometimes it's appropriate to sound a little more elevated than you need to for the situation because it has humor, because it shows creativity and all those kinds of things. So all of us, even those of us who are English monolingual, can do all of these things all of the time, and we're all very good at it. So that's part of what I'm talking about when I say that people are using language and making language in all sorts of ways. It's a human function. There's a last element that's really important to this and that really came to play in my research. And that's that the other element of making language is that we are also consciously thinking about it, planning for it, inventing language as life happens. So, if I'm able to say to someone, I would like to apologize to you for this thing that happened. I did this recently. I apologized to someone for something that wasn't my fault because I knew that apologizing, making the gesture of apologizing was going to smooth things over and get me further ahead with this person. That was conscious, right? That was deliberate rhetorical choice that I made. And that's part of what we mean when we say having consciousness of what language is and how it works. I wasn't actually sorry, but I was using the gesture of being the language of apology because the language of apology meant something. So when I say I'm interested in language diversity, I don't necessarily mean lots of languages together. I mean making language and all that includes. So that term translingual, I've kind of backed my way into this now. That term translingual, a translingual approach to language diversity, it means to ask the question, how do people make language? I'm going to give you one academic quote here from 2 or 3 sociolinguists who work in education, not in my field, but in education. They say that translanguaging is the deployment of a speaker's full linguistic repertoire without regard for watchful adherence to the socially and politically defined boundaries of named and usually national and state languages. So what they're saying is that every single one of us, we have a linguistic repertoire. We have a whole bunch of things in our heads that we can do with language, all sorts of creative, fun tools that we can do with language. And in an ideal world, a world that is not defined by status, by national border, by race, class, any of those things, in an ideal world, we could just deploy that full repertoire and not worry about what the rules are, right? For a student who speaks a variety of African-American English at home, to not have to worry that if she goes to school, she needs to speak in a way that sounds proper enough that her teachers won't scold her, right? Or that she could just play with it more than she is able to. That's kind of what they're getting at. And that's the really contemporary understanding of language that has been very influential in the last 10 or so years in education and in our fields of writing studies that Shannon and I work in the way we teach writing. It has not made as much of an impact when it comes to historical research. And so that's part of what I'm trying to do in this book, is figure out, how do you take this really contemporary understanding of language and do something with it when all you have are a bunch of archival texts sitting in an archive someplace, and that have never been understood as necessarily as multilingual or as translingual. So how do you do that? You go to archives and you start asking questions of archivists and seeing if they can get you stuff that kind of comes at it sideways. So what do people write about their own languages? In other words, how were people of, say 1800 Philadelphia, how were they thinking about language? Particularly in education, is a place where people are usually having lots of overt, conscious discourse about language, because if you're planning a school, if you're planning a curriculum, you're thinking about what your values are, you're thinking about what you want for the next generation, and you're having to make it plain for teachers, for textbooks, for all those sorts of things, for educational policy. You're having to put it out there. And so these are the types of texts that actually do often make it into the archive, because they were important sort of planning documents. One of the really interesting things that I think is really lucky, and that those of us in Pennsylvania can kind of appreciate, is that William Penn, when he wrote the charter for Pennsylvania, he written right into the charter is early 17 something, is the idea that we would have public schools. But we didn't really have the public school system in the sense of run by the government, by the state, until the 1840s. That finally got sort of put into law. So from the beginning of Pennsylvania in the colonial period, all the way up to 1840-ish, Pennsylvania had a lot of schools, but they were all run by local groups, local communities. So of course, the Quakers were really, really good at that. They had lots of schools, but also the German Lutherans, the German Pietists, women working independently. Oftentimes, there were all kinds of schools happening where it wasn't necessarily looking at it as kind of a top-down, state mandated sort of thing, the way we might study education if we were to study education today. So it opens up a lot more diversity than I think we might see otherwise. The other place where you can really find it is when people are talking about their religious faith, because that's another spot where you have to be conscious about language. You don't talk to God the way you talk to your friend, right? And choices about language are often, very distinct. We think of this primarily in faiths that have retained like a sacred text in the original language, like Judaism and Islam. But even for American Protestants, it would matter in things like, for the Germans, retaining German hymns, German scripture, German liturgy. All of those things mattered a lot. And we see that all through American history, where, I've got a friend who goes to the Greek Orthodox Church, and even though he doesn't speak Greek all week, he's hearing the Mass every week in Greek, because that's part of his faith tradition as an immigrant community. So these are the kinds of places where I started to look. And if anybody's interested and wants to start doing this type of research, I can tell you, like, go out to the archives and start looking in these corners, and you will find interesting stuff. So how can we understand an archival text within the community's full linguistic repertoire? And it's a little bit like looking for some clues, and then, like an archaeologist using that to sort of expand out and reimagine what that linguistic repertoire must have been. So that's the background. Thank you for sticking with me on that. Let me move ahead to Philadelphia a little bit. So here's just a quick visual representation of how we might start to rethink this whole thing. Here's the classic picture, right? Cradle of democracy, the dudes in the middle with the papers, writing them up, and they mean important things, right? I'm not trying to say this isn't important or significant or meaningful or even admirable. It totally is. And I think we should all know as much about what the founders were doing and the things they wrote as we can. But if we decenter these men in this space, what does the beginning of the country look like? How does it sound? How do people understand their role in this new democratic space? What kinds of things do people think about their own language? So my project is to figure out how language mattered in early national Philadelphia. And I take this kind of broadly, 1750 to 1830. 1750 was when Benjamin Franklin wrote some stuff about Germans and English, still fairly early on. 1830, 1835 is about the end of my period. By that point, we're kind of moving on into the 19th century and, becoming a more formed country. But that, those decades in there, it took quite a long while for the US to cohere as a place that, had a coherent self-definition. And so people were doing their own thing. And that was really fascinating. This place and time of where the country was getting started is symbolic of who we are as the country as a whole. So if we understand better how people were thinking about language, we can start to shake off our assumptions about how difference in general worked at the time. So we can start to get an image that looks a little bit more like this. And you can see, these guys are still here, but they're not the center any longer. We've got Richard Allen, who was a Methodist minister and really early civil rights leader, absolutely on par with Martin Luther King or anyone else, who founded Mother Bethel Church. And there's Mother Bethel down here on the bottom. That's their 19th century sanctuary, but oldest parcel of land owned by African Americans in this country. There's the Arch Street Friends meeting house, I'm sure you recognize. Here's the Lutheran church, which is no longer there. I think this is where they built the Mint, which is a monstrosity of a building. And one of the German Lutheran ministers that I write about. The This is Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, who I don't write about, but she's one of my favorite Philadelphia women of the time. It's very independent and literary and cool. So it just, it starts to be a different kind of picture, right? And there's a lot more going on. And quite frankly, I think this one is a lot more interesting and exciting. So I look at three communities in Philadelphia in this time period: the Germans, who were very numerous. And I say all the time, Philadelphia was German speaking the way we think of LA as being Spanish speaking, right? I mean, German language was everywhere. I also look at the Quakers, who were a dominant religious affiliation and obviously, founders of Philadelphia, and the reason probably we had so much diversity. And then finally, the free Black community, who were actually about 1/3 of the population around this time. And I chose those three communities because Benjamin Franklin himself had done kind of an early census before the federal census, and said that, by his estimation, the city was basically made up of these three groups. I think by Quakers, he probably meant, white English speakers in general. Of course, there were all sorts of other people around by then as well, Episcopalians and whatnot. The Penn family themselves were not Quaker after a certain point, but generally, those are the three groups that seemed really important and seemed to sort of make Philadelphia what it was. And I would argue even to this day, I mean, we're still we're about 40% white and 40% Black these days, and 20% other stuff. So it's still there. I show how all these communities were working to figure out for themselves what it would mean to be in a democracy. And as I contend, the best way to do that is by looking at how people understood their language. So I argue that these translingual practices that I find constituted the city of Philadelphia. They weren't just supplementing what the founders were doing. It wasn't like there's these important guys and then there's some other stuff, but that they are actually fundamental to the place and time. And so these practices retell a flexible, democratic, and diverse US origin story. So, okay, enough of that. Thank you for bearing with me. Let me show you a couple of examples here. So this is the Germantown School. This is a facsimile of the original charter from 1759. And people up in Germantown got together and said, let's build a school. There were a bunch of schools, but they were kind of, here and there. And they wanted to build a nice, big, solid schoolhouse. Germantown had been around since 1683. By 1750s, it was pretty prosperous and put together. And here's the interesting thing. This is the second page of this charter. They said that the schoolhouse should be a plain, substantial building, properly adapted and accommodated for 2 schoolrooms at least on the lower floor. And the 2 most commodious rooms below stairs should be for the use and purpose of an English and a High Dutch or German school forever. I love their certainty that it would be forever. So what do we see in this? First of all, it's in English, right? Here we are talking about a schoolhouse for German kids, and I'm showing you an English language document. I'm sure that's disappointing. It's the thing that got preserved, right? I mean, that's part of the nature of the archive, is that the things that got preserved were the things that were sort of intelligible to the archivists. So that was part of it. But there's a lot that we can read into it nevertheless. It's a very practical and material document. It's talking about, a building. It's not talking about, educational philosophy like I like to talk about. And it really makes us think of the idea of the classic American schoolhouse, right? There's sort of that pioneer spirit there that we all grew up with, but it's not a one-room schoolhouse that they're talking about. It's this idea that there's 2 rooms, 2 languages, English on, what I'm picturing is like the kids would file in and the English kids would go to the left and the German kids to the right or something like that. it's a bilingual school, right in Philadelphia, right from the very beginning. That is actually kind of remarkable because I think most of us think of bilingual education as, kind of a modern idea that we do with all our multicultural sensibilities. But in fact, it was something in a much more kind of natural and obvious, just part of what the community was doing, because that was what the community was at the time. So the charter shows us that people didn't just live in a place where there was a language other than English, but that they were actively working together to create places that accommodated those languages. And they did it in order to make communication possible, and especially to enable communication and literacy to continue across generations. So this is what became the Germantown Academy, the private school that is now out in Fort Washington. And most of the histories, this is obviously a very prestigious organization, so there have been histories written, and they interpreted the charter to mean that one classroom would be for the German community, the other one would be for English. And that alone, as I said, is enough, right? We've got a bilingual school, but we can start to think of it even more imaginatively as well. We don't know how the children related to one another. We don't know what sorts of shared language they created. We don't know who their parents were, how they married, what their families were like. So in essence, we have very little to say about either their integration or their segregation, what their children's languaging really looked like. Our assumption might be that Germantown was like the original immigrant community that looked just like every other immigrant community, that, the pattern that we know. A group comes in, parents speak the home language. Children don't want to do that. They pick up English at school. By generation 3, the old language is forgotten. And then, all that's left is some recipes and holiday customs and things like that. But the German community actually was very resilient for many, many, many years in the US, and German language schools were all over the place, all across the Northeast, into the Midwest. And by the way, I don't just mean Pennsylvania Dutch, like I still hear snippets of it if I'm out in Lancaster County, but German, right? Milwaukee and Chicago, full of German schools. This continued all the way up until World War I. And it was then that anti-German sentiment made German ethnicity something that people wanted to hide, because suddenly Germany was our international enemy, and so people put it away. So if you go back to that definition of, translanguaging is communicating without watchful adherence to state boundaries and things like that. Look at how long German could continue without that watchful adherence, until suddenly it became a matter of, the world wars of the 20th century and all that destruction. Here's another piece of that destruction. So we can either interpret this document here as an additive model of bilingual citizenship, or as a touchstone that there was a more fluid and translingual possibility of culture present in the early republic. Both are actually really exciting interpretations. Either way, we're challenging the monolingualist assumption that English was just sort of inevitable and logical, and the only outcome that was going to happen for us as a country, because we were founded by English colonialists, right? Okay, that's one example. Let me tell you about the next one. This is Haverford School, of course, Haverford College today. This is a little bit later in the history, 1830. And of course, the Quakers had founded Pennsylvania, believed in simplicity, rejected the idea of an institutional church with, clergy and liturgy and sacraments and all those sorts of things. The idea was to have nothing between yourself and God. By 1830, the Quakers were not as dominant political force as they had been, but still very present culturally. So they were recognizing the need to, they had always been great with schools, but recognizing a need for some higher education. In this case, it was for men only, or, young men. But nevertheless, some higher education, which had not necessarily been part of the tradition. So in 1830, a series of essays appeared in this journal called The Friend. And by the way, these are all at the Haverford College archives, where I was lucky enough to get a fellowship and spend a month hanging out there, which was awesome and lots of fun. And the archivist there at the time actually suggested this, so I owe my thanks to her. So this series of essays appeared in The Friend, and they were written by someone who called himself Ascham. I think it appears at the end, so you don't see her here in the photo, but it was a pseudonym. Ascham is a curious choice because Ascham was the tutor of Queen Elizabeth I. So why would a Quaker be calling himself Ascham? These essays lay out all the aspects of a school. It's kind of like the Germantown document, the curriculum, the buildings, who would attend, how free time would be structured. They were setting up for the Quaker public this idea of what a Quaker college would be. And they were interested in creating what was called a guarded education. So students would live completely within the realm of Quaker practices and guarded from the influence of the outside world. But there was a thing that happened that was not particularly Quakerly, at least not in my book. They were advocating for a classical education. In other words, studying Latin and Greek. And this was sort of strange because, you know, we talk about dead languages today, but even then they were sort of going out of style. Benjamin Franklin was founding University of Pennsylvania with an English school, saying we just need, you know, practical everyday language, something useful. The Quakers, of course, had been shut out of the elite universities in England, and so, you know, that was something for other people. But here's Quakers arguing for classical languages. I think that this is because this community actually has a very intense relationship with the questions of language in terms of how language is the means by which we come to know, right? How we know things. This kind of metalinguistic theorizing is characteristic of translingual practice. So here's one example from the Ascham essay. You've probably read it by now as I've been blathering on. Much of the difficulty which we experience in our inquiries after truth, and indeed in our intercourse with one another, arises from the loose and inaccurate manner in which many people use words. And I am almost ready to believe that the early and critical study of some foreign language is indispensable for the correction of this abundant and dangerous source of error. So in many ways, this is a passage that's kind of reflective of its time. I found a lot of writings from, you know, across the kind of transatlantic world, Scotland and whatnot, where people were saying lots of similar things. The idea that if we just get more disciplined with our words, we could get over all of our disputes. But there's a distinction here, and that's this phrase, inquiring after truth. So much of the difficulty which we experience in our inquiries after truth, that's such a Quakerly thing to say. And while it seems unremarkable, that difference seems to matter here. Slowly and deliberately working towards the truth of what is right for the context at hand. So here's the next slide. From the philosophical construction of a variety of ancient languages, they are by far the most proper for this purpose. And so studying Latin is the best way of acquiring a perfect knowledge of our own tongue. And I love that sense of a perfect knowledge, as if such a thing would be possible, just like the more perfect union, right? It's not possible, but it's something to aim for. Let's look just real quickly at a kind of companion piece. This is the Yale Report of 1828, and this is a famous document in the history of education, because even at Yale, there was pressure to modernize the curriculum, have a much broader curriculum, and get rid of all this dead language crap. And the faculty of Yale, who were very elite and very conservative, were saying, no, 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 we've got to keep it. The Yale Report has a lot of resemblances to what we see in the Haverford essays. The study of classics is useful as it lays the foundations of correct taste. The classics afford materials to exercise talent of every degree. The range of classical study extends from the elements of language to the most difficult questions arising from literary research and criticism. Every faculty of the mind is employed. Not only the memory, judgment, and reasoning, but the taste and fancy are occupied and improved. These are very 18th century ideas of the faculties and sort of the different elements of our being and how they all have to be cultivated in these very precise ways in order to create the ideal citizen. But what's different about these texts? They're both advocating Latin. They're both really kind of conservative. Note that in the Yale report, the end of language study is not truth. It's not ending disputes, as Asham says, but it's the acquisition of individual success and self-worth, so making an ideal person. This is what I mean by a translingual reading, where what appears to be more or less the same turns out to be different. And those differences themselves constitute the language diversity that's so important to understand if we are going to understand the place of difference in democratic formation. So think about how the Quakers sort of matter in a different kind of way, now, and thinking about it this way as we remember history. These subtle differences suggest that sussing out the translingual dispositions of writers in their contexts could reveal much more about the varieties of meta-linguistic thinking in the formation of many communities in the US, not just in early Philadelphia. So if we are going to read translingually, a text like this shows us that by no means was English the center of the nation. Neither was English ideology, even in a community of English-speaking people. So the ideology of, we hear it all the time. You come to this country, you got to speak English, right? That's English monolinguist ideology. And I didn't find a lot of that at this time, right? I'm not saying I didn't find prejudice or racism, because I did, but that particular sort of unilateral form of English language ideology is not necessarily present the way we assume that it must have been. And because it's not present, I think there's hope, right, for all of us. It shows that within communities, there are finely tuned senses of what language is and how it matters to them. It shows us that simply looking at ideology in a broad sweep leaves out a lot. And it suggests that in everyday practice, people really translanguaged a lot. They thought about language, they practiced it, they recognized how their own communities could shape larger ideas to create communities that work for themselves. So these have been two very brief examples, and let me just add a couple of qualifications just so to give you a sense of what else is there to talk about. Yes, these texts are in English. That's part of the lesson that I want to get at here. The second part of it is that I did actually look at some non-English texts. There are German texts that were preserved, and one of the things I'm proud of is that I translated them. So part of the work of the archive is finding out what else there might have been in other languages, but of course, things that got preserved were largely in English. The other thing I don't have time to talk about right now is that the significance of the free Black community and the African-American presence in this question. It's easy, if we talk about language diversity, we tend to talk about immigrant groups and leave out the African-American story, in part because their languages got stolen, right? I mean, they were just obliterated. And of course, African-Americans have been speaking English ever since. But that diversity itself is part of what we need to think about and include in all of this. Just because a language lost visibility and was taken away doesn't mean it isn't present in a different form, in the forms of language diversity. So I'd like to invite us all to think about how a translingual understanding might help us to see languaging that we might not otherwise see. When I look at Philadelphia in the beginning of the country, and I really start to look at what people were writing, I see all the ways that we can shed so many of our expectations of what this country is about. What if we saw the US not in English? What would happen? How could we language now? So I'm going to stop right there because I'm realizing how long that took. But thank you very much. And what do you think?
Awesome, fantastic. So we do have some questions here. I want to start off by asking, oh, I'm sorry, it helped. I want to start off by asking, as far as the, I guess the original settlers, I mean, how did class play into this? Because we talked a lot about how the education system, how they wanted that developed, English, you know, German. But obviously we had laborers here as well, farmers out in the more rural. Were they using the same ways to adapt? They obviously weren't focused on, you know, Greek and Latin at the time, but how were they adapting with each other? Because they obviously were working together as well. Am I making sense?
I can't answer that in full, but one of the interesting stories in this history is the Germans who were the German Pietists. So I talk a lot about the Lutherans who were in the city, and they were sort of I guess a more upper class, but the Pietists who were out in the countryside were really active in starting schools. There was remarkably high levels of literacy in Germany, or in the German areas of Europe. There was no Germany at the time. And they really brought that with them. So if any of you have heard of Christopher Dock, the private school that's out in Montgomery County, he was an early German teacher who ran primary schools, and he wrote the first like pedagogy, like book of how to teach, which is really interesting. And it was a very what we might now call like child-centric. It was about encouragement and positive affirmation instead of discipline. I remember one of the things that he wrote was that if the child did well in his lessons, he would send a note, or her lessons, girls were in it too, he would send a note home, and mom was supposed to give the kid an extra egg. So it was this whole sort of, you know, family teacher child literacy circle that I really loved. So I don't know exactly, you know, it's hard to know exactly who is doing what as far as particular languages. It would have depended on the group. But I do know that that's one sort of fascinating part of the story.
Give my middle schooler an egg tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right, our first question. Did German kids learn English and the English kids learn German?
The Germans talked a lot about learning English, and they were really proud of it, and they didn't see that as being at odds with English. There was one of the early mayors of Philadelphia was German, and I remember reading an essay where they were kind of proudly playing up his prominence, and they wrote a lot about how different languages serve different purposes. So if you wanted to do commerce or you wanted to do government, English was great for that. If you wanted to talk to your family or you wanted to go to church, German was great for that. So it was there's a linguist have a word, diglossia. You know, there's cultures that do that all the time, just not the US. And the Germans seem to be really good at it. How much the English speakers learn German, I don't know, but I suspect that it was something like the way English speakers living in places like LA kind of know Spanish. You know, it's just sort of around, maybe not really know it, but.
That's a very interesting correlation to make, the way you phrased what we know today as Los Angeles in Spanish. Mm-hmm. With German in Philadelphia. I wouldn't have thought that, to be honest.
Yeah, if you look at the artist who did the book cover was really wonderful, and he kind of did some photoshopping of different historic images. So the image is actually Christchurch, which of course is Episcopalian and English speaking, and then there's a shop next door with German language script on the sign, and that was not the actual shop next door, but he took the script from another image from a shop that was a couple blocks away. So it seems like in the linguistic landscape of Philadelphia, there was just sort of German all over the place. So.
Next question from Richard. Do we know how the general public with their respective languages understood words such as life, liberty, or the pursuit of happiness?
Oh, boy. That's a great question. That sounds like a whole other book. Trying to think about the things that popped up. I think because I was looking at schooling and religion, I didn't see that. I didn't notice those sorts of conceptions quite so much. But that may have just been the lens I was looking through at the time. I definitely think the Germans were very interested in the idea of liberty and, in the sense of sort of freedom to do your own thing, to run your own businesses, start your own schools. I think that was a really motivating concept. But I think you need a different historian for the rest of that question.
Next question. What do you know about non-English newspapers during the period you studied?
Well, once again, the Germans were incredible. I mean, they brought this really rich print tradition from Germany. And Christopher Sauer, who was up in Germantown, the first Bible published in the US was actually published in German, not English, or Latin or anything else. And he also ran a really robust newspaper trade, so robust, in fact, that Benjamin Franklin got pissed off about it and was worried that the Germans were getting their own political news, both undercutting his own print business, but also undercutting his political machinations. And he didn't like that. You can imagine, I mean, we see this still today. And so he started his own German language newspaper, which was, just sort of blatantly obnoxious and a ploy that everybody saw through rather quickly. So he actually wrote some really prejudiced stuff about Germans early on. By the end of his life, he'd come around and realized it wasn't really the threat that he thought, but it had to do with all of the political parties with the pen proprietors and all sorts of stuff. So I do know about the German newspapers. No, so there were other languages around. It kind of depends on which time frame you're looking at. The Swedes obviously came even before the English did. So they kind of had a presence, although not as much. We still see that in Old Swedes Church Gloria Dei down in South Philly, which was Swedish for a really long time. Of course, there were many, many indigenous languages and Lenape and their varieties all around. So we can't, of course, that's a huge question that I can't even begin to broach, but there was a lot of interest in those languages. Thomas Jefferson did all sorts of writing of dictionaries and things of indigenous languages. So certainly they were present too. And I'm trying to think what else. The Welsh, they were around early on because William Penn had them be some of the sort of early, what would you call it? Like land speculators almost. They got some of his he sold off some of his land to them pretty early on in order to create settlements. And I think somebody was saying earlier, how much did they really speak Welsh? It seems like they must have, but they also used English all the time and they wrote things in English. There was a famous it seems like Welsh was almost always held up as sort of a cultural symbol more than a language of everyday use. There was a famous event where people from St. David's Church, Radnor, marched to Philadelphia, and then they gave a sermon at Christ Church in Welsh. But I think it was a little bit like, like playing the bagpipes at a funeral. But it's hard to know for sure. So anyway, so that's just some of the variety of languages that I ran across.
Janet from Friends says, interestingly, Haverford was founded by Orthodox Quakers and Swarthmore by Hicksites, two dominant sects from late 1820 to 1950s. She says, I don't know much about the language, though. That's like a little interesting side note there.
Yeah, and that's part of the story. I couldn't get into that, but that's part of the story with Haverford, is that they were Orthodox, who I think became a more elite, upper crusty kind of group. And I think that's part of what was happening with the founding of Haverford. Out at Westtown School, there was a lot of Hicksite influence, and I think there was the perception that things were getting out of control. A bunch of the kids had a Bible burning one night because they got all up in arms about something about, we don't even need the Bible to have the inner light, right? Like, so that was upsetting people. So I think that was a lot of what was going on here. It was also the Quakers grappling with the larger kind of 19th century evangelical movements, and how much do we behave like other religious groups. And this was the period of societies and beneficial organizations. So everybody was founding schools and hospitals and insurance schemes and all those sort of things that build up a more modern 19th century society.
Here's an interesting one. How do we default to English as the language of government and law? With the language diversity we've always had, it doesn't seem obvious that would be the case. It's simply a holdover from English colonial life, or a conscious choice to try to unify the country.
Yeah, I'm glad you put it that way. The traditional line has always been, we should be so proud of ourselves because we don't have a national language, right? Like, we're not like France with that Académie Française, right? We have what has always been called laissez-faire language policy. So, it's great, everybody can just do their own thing. And there were attempts there have always been attempts to have national language. In fact, lots of states have them today, and they always seem to come around whenever there's a sort of conservative resurgence. On the other hand, if that's the case, you're right, you would think that we would be much better at this. I think holdover from English colonial life is probably a fair way to put it, but I would say that a holdover having to do with a sense of what power is and where it comes from. And as the Germans were recognizing, they had no problem staying German, but they knew that if they wanted to be in the legislature, they had to figure out English. So I think it was that unspoken privilege of the English speaking elite that government would be English. I don't think I'm satisfied with that answer entirely, but that's the best I got for now.
Were literacy rates higher among English speaking versus German speaking populations in this time?
My hunch would be that they might have been higher among German groups, actually, because they were pretty good at schooling. And again, I think it might have depended on class. There were, as you got out, the further west you got in Pennsylvania out into the countryside, it really just depends where you're looking. But, I think there were a lot of English speaking white folks who were coming from much more impoverished UK and, you know, Britain and Scotland and all of that, who didn't have a schooling tradition. Whereas in Germany, I think they had these primary education in German has always been a little bit more ingrained in the culture. I know the UK had very low rates of literacy all the way up until like World War II. I mean, the UK did not figure out universal schooling very well for a really long time. And I think that probably translated some to, you know, when people came to the US. So again, it's hard to know. And I'm not a literacy historian, and people who do study the history of literacy have all sorts of empirical ways of figuring it out. So we'd have to do some more research.
Why would the African American have a different language, emphasis on American? Is there any evidence that the African American had a different language other than English, or are you referring to those who were brought to America forcefully? If so, were they referred to as African Americans?
I mean, I was referring to people who got brought to America by virtue of slavery, you know, by having been enslaved, which is a very different situation from coming as an immigrant, even if an immigrant is coming in, you know, a pretty dire circumstance. Because people who were enslavers were intentionally mixing up people from different ethnic groups so that they couldn't talk to each other, and punishing people for using other languages other than English. That's why I'm saying that it's particularly difficult to talk about language diversity and, you know, in a kind of ordinary way, the way we might think about it with the history of immigration. I think the term African American is a late 20th century idea, but it's one that I use because I'm thinking about it in, you know, kind of in the modern sense. And of course they were Americans. But yeah. Does that answer the question?
And then because this is Philadelphia, we'll finish on this question.
Okay.
Recently, the Philadelphia area was in the language news with the invention of John. I'm from the Midwest, so I apparently don't say it properly because I have that more John sound to it. Care to comment on the word John?
Yeah, I don't know. I think I probably know as much as you all. I think it's another word that has come out of African American culture, but has been taken up by everybody, and it's become this really Philly thing. And it's kind of fascinating. I mean, it's certainly a great example of how people continually make language, and it keeps happening all the time. And language doesn't come out of what's in the dictionary. We write the dictionary ourselves, right? So yeah, we seem to be becoming famous for it.
You know, I've lived here for 25 years and I still don't feel like I've earned the right to use the word.
I wouldn't use it myself, quite frankly. I'm just too old and white and stodgy, I think.
Liz, thank you so much. This was absolutely incredible information.
Thank you. It was really fun.
Really appreciate your time. Janet, are you there? Janet Michelson? Can you hear me, Janet? Oh, maybe she's not there. Well, once again, thank you so much. Thank you to everyone for coming out tonight. We really appreciate you being here. Liz, we really appreciate the information. And we appreciate everyone here supporting the Bala Cynwyd Library and all that we try to do for you. So that's it. Everyone have a great night.
Thank you
Liz.
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Liz.
Bye.
Thanks, Autumn. Take care.